thanks for peeling yourself off your sun lounger to come out tonight, because Letitia's brought the weather with us from Marseille, and it's been so glorious, hasn't it? But thank you for making the effort to be here this evening. It's great to gather, and it's great to be able to sing God's praises together. And it's great to be able to open up his word together and to be able to read it and hear what he has to say to us. And tonight we're going to be in Ruth chapter 4. So if you want to turn there or pull that up on your device, whatever way, you can get that in front of you. And while you're doing that, I want to get you to give me a nod if you're old enough to remember days before sat-nav. Give me a nod. Can you remember days before sat-nav? Yes. Well, I've just been doing a bit of reminiscing about what life was like before we had GPS and sat-nav and Google Maps and Apple Maps and all these wonderful things, because I do remember those days, and I remember those days of the paper map across the dashboard, and the paper map that was, to be followed along the way. And yet I do, maybe it's just your family, you don't need to nod, but maybe there were a few arguments about the paper map in your car, because there were certainly a few arguments in our car when I was growing up about what way we should go. But then, of course, we became so technologically advanced, didn't we? Because then we got MapQuest. And whenever we got MapQuest, we got those step-by-step instructions printed out, and we would bring those with us thinking we were the bee's knees, because we had our step-by-step instructions of how we were going to get to our destination. But of course, you take your eyes off it for 2 seconds and you've forgotten what step you're on of the journey and what U-turn or what left turn or right turn you should be on. And so we are so grateful, aren't we, for GPS, for these maps that just tell us exactly where to go, tell us whenever there's going to be a diversion. Well, not tonight though, but we are grateful for most of the time that we can see if there's going to be any traffic, and so we don't end up in those unfamiliar roads or that uncertain area that you don't know how you're going to get out of. And yet it also saves relationships, doesn't it? Whenever we don't have to argue with one another, but we can just blame the GPS if things go wrong. But I wonder in your life if you ever find yourself on a road that you didn't choose to be on. I wonder, have you ever looked around and things don't seem very familiar anymore? Maybe you have arrived at a destination that you didn't expect to be at in your life. Maybe in one particular area of life, it seems like you didn't have a choice, but you're just here. And you're on a path maybe that you wouldn't have chosen for yourself. Well, this whole book of Ruth is teaching us about an ordinary family, maybe like yours or mine, who have made some choices, yes, along the road of life, but they've ended up in destinations that they would never have chosen. And this family living in Bethlehem in the time of the Judges is surrounded by disobedience and idolatry. If we just skip back to Judges 21:25, it tells us that at that time, everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. And now I read that and I think that's my family. Everyone just seems to do what's right in their own eyes sometimes, don't they? Maybe it's just in our house. But this was an ordinary family living in a time of idolatry. Maybe different kinds of idolatries, but maybe not that different after all, with the same hearts that exist in our culture today. And yet this ordinary family have a God that providentially weaves the course of their lives into a story that we can read tonight, that we can read thousands of years later and find encouragement in. And so through this story tonight, I hope that we can leave this evening rejoicing in our redemption. I want us to leave tonight rejoicing once again, or perhaps maybe for the very first time, rejoicing in our redemption. Because no matter how ordinary or how bleak life's path might seem for you tonight, when God is involved, we can trust that his hand of providence is involved. He's weaving through our lives a greater story together, despite the wrong turns, despite the parts of the road that we didn't expect to be on, maybe the setbacks or the diversions that we face. All of these things can be used as part of his tapestry of our life to be able to work together his purpose and plan. Now, the story of Ruth might be very familiar to some of you. I recognize that this is maybe a familiar book of the Bible to you, but maybe for others it might be a bit patchy. So let's just do an overview of how we get to chapter 4. I'm going to be quick, don't panic. But we'll do a quick overview of this ordinary family. We have a husband and wife, Naomi and Elimelech, and they have 2 boys. And at that time they encounter a famine in the land of Bethlehem. And so they decide to leave Bethlehem and they travel to Moab, which is a land of their longtime enemies, the Moabites, to avoid the famine. And there their boys, they meet these Moabite wives, but for reasons we're not told, the 3 men in this family, they die. Naomi's husband and her 2 sons all die. And so Naomi is left with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they journey back towards Bethlehem, where there was a talk of the famine ending. And in this bleak season of Naomi's life, she says, "Call me Mara," meaning bitter, because she had lost all of her security living in these days. She had no husband and no sons to provide for her. And she said in verse 21 of chapter 1, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." She wouldn't have chosen this path for her life. It maybe seemed that God had forgotten her family, and she was feeling empty. And on the way back to Bethlehem with her 2 widowed Moabite daughters-in-law, they reach a crossroads where she says to the girls, "If you want to go back and restart your lives in your homeland, go. It's fine. Go back and be with your own families and start again." So one of the girls does go back to Moab, but Ruth, this foreigner, a widow, and a woman of lowly estate, she vowed to Naomi that she would go back to Bethlehem with her. She famously declared in Ruth chapter 1, 16 and 17, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Then we go to chapter 2, where these 2 grieving women, Naomi and Ruth, arrive back in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, one of the first signs of hope in this book. Ruth is found in the harvest fields where, by divine providence, she meets a man called Boaz, who is a distant relative of her family. He shows favor to Ruth and to Naomi. He had heard of Ruth's actions in returning to Bethlehem with Naomi, and he blesses her, and he allows her to glean in his fields. He was a man of standing, and fitting to his character, he protects Ruth, and he provides for her. He provides abundantly for her, and so she has food and water, and she faithfully works in his fields. Then in chapter 3, the story moves from the fields to the threshing floor, where under the cover of darkness, Ruth, under Naomi's instruction, essentially proposes marriage to Boaz in the middle of the night. So you can study that in your own time. We're not going to get into that tonight, all the meaning and symbolism behind that passage. But essentially, Ruth is saying to Boaz, "You're a close relative of ours. I would be willing to marry you and for you to become our Redeemer." And so just as things seem to be romantically coming to this climax, you can imagine the excitement that things are falling into place. Then there's a twist in the story that everybody is like, "Oh," because Boaz explains to Ruth there's another relative that's closer, and that would be a closer Redeemer who has the right to be able to redeem their family first. But our lovely Boaz has a plan. And that's where we're going to pick up the story in chapter 4, where we're at the town gate. So at the city gate, or the town gate in those days, that's where would have been like a courtroom scene nearly, where the people that would have been wanting to have any family affairs or business deals dealt with publicly could go. And it's like an open courtroom. So Boaz goes about carrying out this transaction of redeeming Ruth in front of everybody at the town gate. And so this is the beginning of the redemption story, where Ruth can be redeemed, but also Naomi and us too, as we'll see later on. And as we consider this theme of rejoicing in our redemption tonight, the first thing I want us to see in chapter 4 is our need for redemption. The need for redemption. Because of the death of the men in their lives, Naomi and Ruth, they've got no secure source of income. They've got no inheritance, no name, no status, and no future. Both women are in a place of destitution, and unless they were redeemed, it would ultimately lead to their death. And so redemption was this God-ordained pattern in the Levitical law, where through a redeemer, a close relative of the family, he could redeem and set free these women from their plight and be able to bring them in under his family, to be able to redeem them and provide for them and protect them. So let's go to the town gates and see this legal drama play out. Verse 1. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat there. Boaz lives up to his word. He said to Ruth, "I will make it my mission to settle this matter the very next day." I love his intentionality. What a contrast with chapter 3. They meet in the middle of the night in the threshing floor, and these events yet are completely the opposite. They're in broad daylight, sitting at the very public town square. It would be like going and sitting outside the city hall to have this discussion and make this transaction, or going to your local shopping centre where all the people are coming and going. No one could miss that there's something happening here, and you imagine all the nosy parkers stopping. What's happening here? What's going on? And so that's what it was like. When the kinsman redeemer, verse 1, had mentioned came along, this closer relative, Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here." And they did so. So everyone is sitting around the gates, and a crowd may start to assemble around them. But Boaz gets straight to business, verse 3. Then he said to the kinsman redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people." So Boaz, interestingly, he leads the discussion with the sale of the land. There's no mention of Ruth here, no mention of Naomi being around. He only leads the discussion with the buying of the property. And that was one of the roles or the jobs of a redeemer in this Levitical law and custom. So you can imagine he'll be hearing, well, I could buy this land for a cheap price and be able to invest in that as another part of my civic reputation, as another part of my business, and another investment. It seemed like a bargain without any risk, and that he would be able then to grow his estate. What is there to lose? Well, the end of verse 4. He says, "If you redeem it, do so, but if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." So immediately he says, "I will redeem it." It was an easy transaction for him to make, wouldn't it have been? It's a bit like the tappity-tap on the old card at the minute, isn't it? It's a little bit too easy to make a transaction these days. We don't feel the weight of handing over the money and counting it out anymore. It was a quick decision for him. "I will redeem it," he said. Now, the story sits on a bit of a knife edge because we all want Boaz to get together with Ruth, don't we? But yet this redeemer is in front. And it seems like he's so eager to grow his own estate that he's willing to just go through with the transaction. But then there's a twist. There's a cost of the redemption. Boaz then moves on in verse 5 to talk about the cost of redeeming Ruth and Naomi. Boaz said, "On the day you will buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, you acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." So here's the catch, my friend. If you get the land, you also have to take Ruth. Ruth was a foreigner, and if he bought the land, he would automatically buy her. And so this is a spanner that's been thrown in the works for this man. We don't even know his name. He's just called friend. Will the deal be on, or will the deal be off? Verse 6. At this, the kinsman redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate." Simply put, he says, I can't afford it. It's too big a risk. It would ruin the inheritance that I already have. It's not financially lucrative. It would be a loss for me to have to invest in this and then have to share it with any children that Ruth might produce as heirs. The cost would be greater than the initial investment, and it would be a drain on me to take this on. So what we're seeing here in this scene is that this redeeming work requires personal sacrifice. It requires someone to give up more than they will gain to be the redeemer for Ruth. It requires an act of love. It requires sacrifice. And this friend wasn't prepared to offer it. But Boaz is. Boaz is motivated by love and not the law. He's not motivated by his own inheritance, and he's willing to pay the price for Ruth's redemption. And that's the central theme of this whole book, because Ruth is this outsider. She's this Moabitess woman. She's a widow, and she's far from home, but she's about to be rescued. She's about to be rescued from certain death by the generous love of this powerful man in her society that she's found herself in. And he will gain acceptance for her, and she will become one of his family. She's being redeemed. Verse 6 goes on to say, "You redeem it yourself," our friend says. "I cannot do it." That's the second time he tells Boaz that he can't do it. He's been very clear. From the outset, he was like, "Yeah, I'll take that." But actually, no, you take it. No, definitely you take it, Boaz. Boaz is a man of integrity, and he keeps his word to every last detail. He's willing to accept all the baggage that would come with this deal. But our friend wouldn't. Boaz accepted the duty to be the redeemer, but our friend, he declined. And Boaz here is a model of this word, hesed love, the loving kindness that he is showing to Ruth, to be able to redeem her at personal sacrifice. And so the narrator now interrupts the flow of our story in verse 7 to give us a bit of context. And it says, now in the earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was a method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, verse 8, buy it yourself. That's the third time now he's told Boaz to buy it. And he removed his sandal. And this sandal transaction, as weird as it seems, basically symbolizes the transfer of something from one party to another in their custom. And so this was the right of redemption being passed from our friend to Boaz. Our friend no longer has any rights or responsibilities to care for Elimelech's land or to provide an heir. His part is over. He exits the story. We never hear from him again. Goodbye, our friend. And as sure as Boaz holds that sandal before his peers, he is the kinsman redeemer and has the rights to Ruth and her family. Verse 9, then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. So in comparison with verse 3, where he kind of talks loosely about this piece of land that the friend might want to buy, he gives the exact details of everything that he has bought in this transaction and that he is now responsible for. Interesting, isn't it, that he just presented things in such a way, maybe because he just so desperately wanted to marry Ruth and redeem her himself. And now it seems that the dead family might live because of this loving kindness, this hesed love that Boaz has shown. And this leads to a clear blessing of redemption. There's the need of redemption, there's the cost that's been paid, and then there's the blessing of redemption. Verse 10. I have also acquired Ruth, the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among the family or from the town records. Today you are witnesses. Boaz is spelling out Ruth's double trouble in a sense, because she's a foreigner and she's a widow. But Boaz legally acquires her as his wife. And this marriage would provide security and a reward for which both Naomi and Boaz previously prayed that Naomi would be rewarded for her loyalty. And so as Boaz's wife, Ruth is no longer an outsider, but she is brought into this covenant community of Israel. So how will the crowd react? Verse 11. Then the elders and all those at the gate said, we are witnesses. This transaction is now legally binding. And they pronounce this blessing over Boaz at the end of verse 11. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. I wonder, are they suggesting that something special might come from this family? Because their family name would become famous in Bethlehem. And this short scene forms this culmination of this whole book, where the redemption is resolving the death and the emptiness of the first chapter. They've gone from being empty to full. And let's see how that then plays out. Because in this new blessing of redemption, there's a new wife and a new life, verses 13 to 15. So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. Then he went in to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. What a reversal for this family. Ruth arrived into Bethlehem as this foreigner widow with no rights, no hope. She became a servant. She became someone who worked in the fields for her survival. And now she was a wife of one of the most leading men in that town. And we can't forget what Ruth chapter 1 tells us. She was married to her previous husband, who passed away, for 10 years. And they didn't have any children. For 10 years she was childless. But God is the subject of this part of the passage. The Lord enabled her to conceive. and she gave birth to a son. God gave her conception, another version says. After 10 hard years of painful infertility, God enabled her to have a baby. This is a miracle baby. And for a brief instant in this book, God is mentioned, and he steps out of the shadows in these difficult circumstances that have been through all the chance encounters. We can see his hand at parts of the story, but here he comes under the spotlights, and he shows us his sovereignty and his goodness in giving them a baby. Just as Boaz blessed Ruth in chapter 2, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. God repaid Ruth for her loving kindness towards Naomi. Think about what the text is saying. This child is a gift from God, derived from divine and not human initiative. And this child would have a divine destiny, as we'll see. And what's interesting here is that the scholars teach us that this last part of the passage has some brackets around it called an inclusio, where it says she gave birth to a son at the start, and then in verse 17 it says a son has been born. This son is a really important blessing on this redemption, this new life, the significance of this baby, born a son, which is so significant in those days to be able to carry on the family line. This baby has arrived, and with its arrival, it's as if Ruth and Boaz and the people in the town gate who are looking around all look towards this baby, and they bless it, and they speak some prophecy over this baby, perhaps. They have a special understanding of what this baby's life could mean. But then we have Naomi enter the story again after an absence from the main narrative. And things are different in Naomi's life now, especially compared to the bleakness of chapter 1. And we're going to move into the living room with Naomi, with some of the women in the town that are all sitting, maybe perhaps talking about this new baby that has been born. And just like the elders at the town gate gave a blessing to Boaz, so did the women to Naomi. Verse 14. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer." I think it's fascinating, that little phrase, "this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer," because we can't underestimate the difference a day can make with God. One day, things can change in our lives. When God chooses his way and his will, one day can change everything. And that was the case for this family. One day made a difference in Ruth's life. One day she went out to the field. Whose field was she in but Boaz's? One day could change their destiny under God. And what did the women hope then that this baby would become? Verse 14 tells us, "May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age." This is another reversal in the story, isn't it, for Naomi? To be promised and to be blessed with this renewal of her life. What a contrast. To go from being empty and hungry, physically and spiritually, to feeling full and have that provision of an heir in her family. And how was this possible? Verse 15, "For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Sons were so revered in this culture and society. To have 7 sons was optimal. I can't imagine having 7 sons. But to have 7 sons in those days would have been optimal, apparently. And it would have been so highly revered to have many sons. And yet they're saying, "Ruth, who loves you, is better than 7 sons to have given birth to just one for her." So what does Naomi do now? Or what will God do next? Verse 16, "Then Naomi took the child, laid him on her lap, and cared for him." The story has come full circle, hasn't it? Back to its initial leading figure, Naomi, the matriarch of this family, who once wanted to be called Mara. "Call me bitter, because the emptiness of my life is so hard to bear." She went from famine, barrenness, death in her life, despairing of not ever having any children again in chapter 1. She now sits with a grandchild in her well-worn arms. After all the tragedy, after all the darkness, there's such joy here, there's such hope. And we get to see this redemption story unfold. And the women said in verse 17, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed, which means servant of Yahweh. And this baby wouldn't only restore her life in the present and sustain her into her old age, but through his seed line, this baby would serve God's people immensely. And who would have thought that this baby would actually become somebody that we would talk about today? That perhaps these people, as they blessed Naomi and as they blessed Boaz, were speaking prophecy over their lives. Because this baby would become famous throughout Israel. Because this baby would become the grandfather of King David. And that family line then would bring another baby that would be born in Bethlehem. And so this simple story of this ordinary family, John Piper puts it so well, opens out like a stream into an ocean of hope. And that ocean of hope is something that we get to be a part of today, because there's so many parallels in this story of the gospel and the greater redemption story that we find ourselves as part of. Verse 17 onwards teaches us of the genealogy of many sinners, heartbroken people who God chose to share in the lineage that would bring this baby to become the Savior and Redeemer of the world. There would be King David, and then that king would then lead to another baby that would be born under Bethlehem skies as well, into a very ordinary family who would submit themselves to God's plan. This baby would be divinely conceived and ordained by God to be our Redeemer. Because just like Ruth needed redemption, everyone in this broken world we live in needs a kinsman redeemer too, don't we? One that can rescue us from our greatest problem, our problem of sin. And we feel this need today, don't we? We feel our world as we look around, how fallen it is at times, how broken it is. As it said in Judges, when everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. There's such a need for redemption for us and for our world. And like Ruth, because of her state as a foreign widow, without any family in Bethlehem, she was regarded as good as dead. And yet the Bible tells us that we are spiritually dead in our trespasses and sin. And just as Ruth needed someone to pay the price for her physical state, we need someone to pay the price for our spiritual state. We need a new heart and a new life given to us. And Boaz's love for Ruth reminds us of the love that the Lord Jesus Christ has for us. Despite her being an outcast, he noticed her and he spoke to her. He gave her dignity and he provided for her. He protected her and he cared for her. And so I don't know how you come before God tonight, but whether you're an outsider, whether you're an oddball, whether you're a sinner, a sufferer, a stranger, a wanderer, a prodigal, whether you're weary or heartbroken, God sees us for who we really are, and he still loves us. We are all enslaved to sin in different ways, and we're ultimately on a path to death without the redemption of Jesus Christ in our lives. And yet, like Ruth in her state, we can't redeem ourselves. No matter what we do, we cannot save ourselves by being good, by trying to keep all the rules, play the game, do the act. We need redemption from someone who can pay the price. And God sees that, and he knows that, and he loves us enough to pay the cost that's owed for our sin. And so while we're amazed at Ruth's love for Naomi to be able to follow her back to Bethlehem, and Boaz's love for Ruth to be able to redeem her, how much more amazing is the love of Jesus Christ? He's the perfect expression of this hesed loving kindness. Just as Boaz said, I will do it, I will redeem her, Christ said, I will go. And it came at a cost, because the greatest transaction that was ever made cost the owner of the world everything. And it was all because of his hesed loving kindness. John 3:16, I'm sure you'll know it. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Think of all the legal wranglings that Boaz went through at the town gate, but think of what Christ did for us, who stood before the chief priests and teachers of the law when he was falsely accused, and he didn't open his mouth, who walked in front of the religious leaders of the city and walked past the town gate out of Jerusalem to Golgotha and gave up his life for those who would believe in him. Christ didn't hand over his sandal to pay for us. He got into our shoes. He lived a life sinless, and understood what it was like to be human. And yet he handed over his body, Philippians 2:7, but he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. And when he was alone in the Garden of Gethsemane, and when he cried out from the cross in agony of soul, there was no Redeemer sent for him, because he was the Redeemer. This is amazing love. How can it be that you, my King, would die for me? So just as Boaz was the only Redeemer left for Ruth, Jesus is the only Redeemer who can save us. He has the power, and he can do it, so that we can then enjoy the blessing of redemption. Think about what Jesus has done for you through his work on the cross. Ephesians 1 verse 7 helps us when it says, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our sins in accordance with the riches of God's grace. There's nothing anyone can take away from that. It is safe, it is secure, it is legally binding that when we put our faith and trust in Jesus, we're justified legally. We no longer are seen as sinners before a holy God. And just like Ruth and then Naomi become co-heirs of this inheritance because of Boaz's redemption, we too have an unshakable inheritance that is paid for and shared with us through Jesus. Because his work of redemption that is carried through from Ruth's family into the birth of her son Obed, who would become the grandfather of King David, would then lead to the line of Jesus, who then in life and death and resurrection and ascension essentially redeemed the world for God. So the blessing of this little baby for Naomi, they said, was better than 7 sons. But the blessing of our redemption is better than anything the world can offer us, because it gives us a future inheritance that is something to be excited about. And we've been on this journey through the book from the house of bread. That's what Bethlehem was known as, the house of bread, where life started full for Naomi. She had her husband, she had her 2 sons, but then it quickly became empty. And then because of love, there was this redemption. There was new life, there was hope, and the bread of life would eventually come from this family line, from empty to full. Can you see that? From empty to full. I think this book could be a brilliant movie. I'm sure maybe somebody has tried to make it into a movie, but you think of this family living in foreign lands, the funerals, the legal wranglings, a wedding, and then a baby. But I wonder about your family tonight. Maybe you're part of an ordinary family like Ruth's. I wonder where you would put yourself on the path of redemption in this season of your life. Maybe you're on a long road that you didn't choose. Maybe you're enduring emptiness, and we should call you Mara too. Maybe you're awaiting God's sovereign hand to move and to step in to the light in your life. Or maybe you need to turn and walk in a different direction, trusting in God's sovereignty over your life. Maybe you're being challenged to love sacrificially with this hesed, this loving kindness. Wherever you're at today, can I encourage you that the loving kindness of God will write the last chapter in your story? Because Romans 8:35 tells us, who or what can separate us from the love of Jesus Christ? And like Naomi and Ruth, we too live with the effects of sin in all areas of our life. Sometimes it seems like there's no way to escape the groanings of this sin-stricken world that we live in. Darkness can come and descend in our lives, and we can find ourselves on a path that we maybe would never have chosen. Yet God's redeeming power is still at work in ordinary families like ours. It's teaching us that when we feel like God has abandoned us in the darkness, maybe seems like he's forsaken us in the shadows, that we mustn't panic, but that we must place all of our hope in God and in his providence and in his great redemption story that's yet unfinished. We don't know the full redemption yet. We don't know the fullness of all the inheritance that has been sealed by Jesus' blood for us yet. But the best is yet to come, isn't it? The best is still to come, and we can look forward to that as we await. Because this ordinary family of Ruths would wait generations before they would see the blessing of King David. And then they would wait generations before they would see the birth of Jesus. And so we wait. We wait in faithfulness, we wait in hope, we wait trusting with patience that God will bring about his full redemption story to a culmination when he returns. And we can look forward to that day where he will right every wrong, where he will wipe every tear that is wept over the brokenness and the sinfulness of this world that we live in. And we have this sure and steady hope of a redeeming God. And that is cause for us to rejoice this evening. Let's just pray as we finish up. God, you're our Father in heaven, and you're our wonderful Redeemer. You're the author of this Hesed love that we get to enjoy. You know us, you know our needs, you know the path that we're on, and yet you still love us, and you care for us, and you meet our greatest needs for redemption. Help us to sit under the light of the gospel tonight and allow it to warm our hearts once again. Remind us of your love for us. Remind us of your sovereignty, even in the small details of our lives. Lord, I just pray that you would reveal yourself once again as the God who cares, the God who knows, the God who sees the darkest parts of our soul and the hardest parts of our life. And yet you choose to redeem us, Lord, because of your Son, Jesus Christ. I pray that that would bring us hope this evening. I pray that that would bring us joy, that despite our circumstances, that we can rejoice because of the redemption that you've won for us through Jesus. Lord, may our lives glorify you as we live in this hope.